sorry, I have to put that in there, but I would forget to record if we didn't do that. And so we will start today's webinar, and I'll turn it over to my colleague at Michael Storr at NTACT and to introduce our experts and conduct the webinar. Take it away, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Deanna. So I'm Michael Storr, as Deanna said, and I work for NTACT. And I would like to just start with going over who will be presenting today on our webinar on family engagement. So we're going to start with Josie Badger, who is a co-director for RAISE, the RAISE Center, and she's going to talk a little bit about RAISE and the role of PTIs, parent training initiatives in our country. We're next going to move and talk about the importance of family engagement in the transition process and touch on a little bit about the dignity of risk. Unfortunately, we're having a nor'easter moving through Pennsylvania right now, and Becky Fogel, who was going to be presenting this afternoon on that topic, will not be able to join us, so I'll be actually covering the material in that section. Then we're going to move on, and Tanya Weishman from the Parent Network of Western New York is going to present on family engagement and transition to adulthood, things to think about. She's also going to share some resources that they have from the Parent Network of Western New York. And then we will be wrapping up with the final presentation from Lisa Myers, who's a life course consultant, talking about life course and family engagement. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to turn this over to Josie Badger. And Josie, are you there? Oh, Josie.
I'm not seeing her online anymore.
Okay, well, there is the storm moving through Pennsylvania, where Josie is also sitting. I think maybe what I'll do is advance through the slides to the next section, and then we'll see if Josie joins us. Deanna, if you could just kind of look for her to pop back on.
I'll do that, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're just going to move. So if you're following in the PowerPoint, we're just at slides.
Josie Badger just joined.
She just joined.
Oh, all right, thank you. We thought maybe the story was you, but I'm glad you're there.
I am here. Thank you, Michael. So everyone, thank you for joining, and I'm so happy that NTACT has invited me to present on this session. I'm going to talk about RAISE, which is the program that I am co-director of. We're going to talk about the RSA PTIs and the PTIs. Personally, I guess I'm a little biased, but I feel that these organizations which work directly with families and youth are key to the family engagement, the youth engagement piece, but unfortunately, many of us are still working within silos. So a little bit about RAISE. RAISE was funded by the RSA Rehab Service Administration in 2014, and we were funded to provide support to RSA parent training information centers that are throughout the United States. And these centers specifically work with youth and families, and the youth are individuals with disabilities who are around transition age. And you can see the list below of the different parent centers if you're on slide 2. These parent centers are kind of scattered throughout the U.S., and they often serve many states and provide technical assistance on transition issues. So what RAISE does, we employ strategic use of various technical assistance to make sure that the parent centers are able to best support their families, youth, and the other parent centers that they work with. So we provide webinars on various transition topics, resources, face-to-face summits. But what we try to do from a national perspective is to look at what are common themes, what is going on there, promising practices, what is happening at a national level that crosses over state boundaries. for a lot of youth or individuals in general with disabilities, a lot of the programs are very state specific, very unique to their state. And so we try to look at the larger picture to help these RSA parent centers identify what is working in other regions that they might be able to implement within their own state. Next slide. So what are the RSA PTIs? I mentioned that they are centers, 7 different parent centers funded by the Rehab Service Administration to support transition throughout the U.S. And many of these centers support other states in transition. For these groups, they really try to help families and youth learn to navigate the adult support system. So I think that growing up in pediatrics, in youth support services, we assume that we step out of our pediatric doctor and walk into the adult service doctor. And if you have been through transition, you know that that is not the situation at all. And sometimes insurance changes, sometimes the medical system changes. And so we try to help support the family centers in teaching their families and youth about navigating. These parent centers work to help youth speak up about what they want. So we've been working with the idea of youth engagement, youth advocacy, ultimately for youth determination, self-determination, even though this is something that I would assume people on this call already know and believe strongly in. There are still a lot of individuals who are trying to empower their young adults in having a voice and setting goals for themselves. And then these parent centers are gaining expertise and resources for engaging youth and families in learning about transition and how to access support. So once again, because the systems are so very different between pediatric or youth services and adult services, they're kind of the navigators to help families identify these supports. If you are looking or are interested in finding the parent centers, there is some information about the RSA PTIs, and you can look at that link provided on that screen. Next slide. So the parent training information centers are spread out through the U.S. and its different cities. And there's approximately 100 parent centers throughout the U.S., including those in territories. And these centers really span the entire lifetime from birth to age 26, which is generally accepted as one of the ages of transition. And these centers are sort of a stepping stone or helping parents find the initial support, learn how to advocate, learn how to speak up, but then also be able to find other parents who have been in similar situations. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we try as parent centers to work across the silos. Just as an individual with a disability, I know that fortunately my doctors won't talk to my employer, who won't talk to my home and community-based services, and that's good and bad. The good part is we can maintain privacy and confidentiality. The bad part is we often don't know what other systems are doing. We often lack coordination of care, and so the parent centers, including the RSA PTIs, can kind of start to bridge that. Next slide. And that's why we have these little walking tightrope RSA PTI individuals who are walking the line between the silos. We know that they technically connect. Every person as an individual is the connector between silos. However, we need help. We need parent professionals to run between the silos, to share information, to make sure that all of our youth and families are fully aware of what is available to them and their rights. And this, by giving this information to families and youth, they are able to be engaged. They are able to step up and have a voice. And I believe by doing that, it empowers them to then work with vocational rehab, to go further with their home and community-based services, to get the support they need to have the most successful adult outcome. Next slide. So this is just our basic website. It provides more information about RAISE and the RSA PTIs, where you can visit all of their websites. I just wanted to thank NTACT again for letting me speak and see if there are any questions.
And also, Josie, you may want to mention one of the handouts is your, I guess, annual report.
Yes, indeed. So you have been given a snapshot from RAISE. This snapshot provides information from the past 4 years that we've been working, and it gives an overview of what we have done here nationally, but also of each of the RSA PTIs. It gives a little bit about their successes, their highlights, and specific projects that they've been working on.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions for Josie? If you do, please type them in.
Yeah, Josie's going to need to step off before the end of it.
Right.
So here, this is your opportunity to ask Josie about anything about the RAISE Center that she provided such a great overview of.
And I think, you know, just to reiterate what Josie was saying, you have several links in those slides regarding parent centers in your state and the work that's happening with the RSA PTIs. So I really would reference, including that summary document that Josie provided. It has some great resources indicated there.
Right. And you can locate the PowerPoint at transitionta.org, NTACT's website, and under events, under the description of this webinar. Looks like there's no questions, so Michael, continue on.
I'm going to move on. Josie, thank you so much. Hope you have a great day. Thank you. Okay, we're next going to move in and talk about the importance of family engagement in the transition process and the dignity of risk. If you're just joining us, Becky Fogel, who is the Managing Director of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network at the Patton East office, actually got stuck in the nor'easter that's currently happening in Pennsylvania. So she's not going to be able to join us, but I'm going to go ahead and cover this section of information. And really what we want to talk about in this section is looking at why engaging families is such a critical role for anyone working with transition age youth, whether they're in education or they're in the VR system or they're an agency provider in the healthcare system or working with IDDD families and youth. So to start with, family caregiver engagement really is one of the most important partnerships that we can form as professionals in working with transition age youth. And there was a family member that I worked with a number of years back, and she had stated that, you know, families will still be there after everybody else has exited the scene. So after the student has graduated from high school and after, you know, the supports coordinators may have come and gone, or job coaches, or there's different VR counselors, the family is that constant. They're the folks that have been there all along and working with their sons and daughters, and they will continue to be there to support their sons and daughters through adult life. And I think that's an important point for us to remember that they really end up being these primary support folks for their kids. It's important to remember as professionals that families are really the experts regarding their sons and daughters. As I mentioned, they have been there from the beginning. They have worked with numerous systems, really have met with successes as well as struggles and barriers. They continue to be that long-term support for their sons and daughters. For a long time, they have been advocating for services and supports. And it's also important to remember that just like with the youth, young adult students themselves, families really do vary in their capacity to support their sons and daughters in really what their knowledge base is and their experiences. It's also important to remember that families are dealing with many, many issues. We come in, I think, with our own set of objectives, either if we're coming from the education system, we're coming from the VR system, or from the human services systems, or the healthcare system. We have our goals in place. Those may or may not necessarily be the primary issues that are a concern to that family and working with their sons or daughters so they can be successful once they leave high school. The other point too is that it's really important that we provide an environment where a family feels that their information that they're providing is valuable, that we are offering a mechanism for them to provide information and to connect to the team that's working with that young person. It's also important that we're starting this process early, and this is especially true, I think, for folks in the education system, the human services system, as well as healthcare, that we're not waiting until that young person is in their late teens or early 20s to start talking about what is transition going to look like. It's really important to start making those commitments and those relationships early, forming that foundation to work with that family and that young person. It's important to build a trustworthy relationship, opening those lines of communication, really being committed. If we're saying something is going to occur, that it actually does occur, or if there's a holdup, that we explain that to the family and talk about some of the issues as to why something may not occur in the exact timeline that we had originally projected. As I mentioned before, families do have a long history of working with education and agencies, and it's important to maybe regain their trust if they've had some difficult experiences, but also to just maintain that flow towards what are those ultimate goals that that young person wants for their future. We are going to hear a little bit from Tanya and Lisa about futures planning, but I think it's really important that we recognize that in working with the family. It's also important that we recognize cultural differences of families and really have a good understanding of what that family expectations are for their sons or daughters. As I mentioned, it's important to introduce the concept of transition planning early. And oftentimes people say, well, how early? And in my mind, it's at birth almost. I mean, we really need to start as early as possible. Again, for those in education, I think really starting to talk about this process in the early elementary grades is really vital. A family member that I had worked with, starting in 3rd grade, would bring up, what are the expectations? This is where I really see my daughter when she graduates. And granted, it's many, many years off, but this is ultimately where I see her as far as her competitive integrated employment situation, her living situation, and her goals towards going on for further education after high school. So it's important to have that as a guide, again, starting as early as possible. It's also important that we recognize terminology that we're using. Oftentimes, families have no idea what you're talking about when you use the word transition. And I think that word can mean so many different things. So instead of starting this discussion with transition, really talking about, hey, we're going to start talking about how to prepare for the future with your sons and daughters. And these are these future planning goals that we call transition. I think that even though that seems really simplistic, That's a really important factor. And then as we start to use a lot of the acronyms that we have and start talking about a lot of the transition terminology, either through education or through our agencies, that we are making sure that it's understandable for the family and the young person. It's also important that we talk about independence and self-advocacy with the family. They have been supportive and protective of their sons and daughters from birth on. And we are now moving into an area where we're talking about, well, your sons and daughters need to be as independent as possible and to be as engaged in the community as possible. And that oftentimes can be very frightening to a family. So really to start having those discussions. We're going to talk in a minute about the dignity of risk and really looking at having young folks be as independent as possible. As I mentioned, it's important with families to build trust and to foster ongoing communications and supports. So some additional things to think about when we're assisting families in this process. It's important that we are moving from kind of this mindset of school, and that's why I mentioned here an elementary IEP, digital education program, and to really talking about this transition-driven planning. And that transition-driven planning is really looking at planning through both education, the IEP, or the VR system, an IPE, or through the IDDD system, looking at an ISP plan. I think it's also important to note that if a young person is engaged with multiple agencies and has multiple plans, that we're looking at how we can best coordinate those goals for that young person. Again, oftentimes I think we fall short, and each of us have our own outcomes and our goals. Josie mentioned this in her presentation. We're somewhat siloed, but we are really talking about one individual, one student in this transition process. And I think for that young person, that youth, that student, as well as their families, it's important that we really identify what are those key goals that we need to work on, regardless of which agency, educational entity is working on those. As I mentioned, it's important to introduce this concept of preparing for the future or transition, and to have a handout, a video, a booklet regarding this process. Likewise, for the agency, the VR system, or the healthcare system, or the IDDD system, that you have information regarding your programs and the supports that you can provide for that young person and their families. The other piece that's on this slide is to not overwhelm. We all know there are a ton of resource guides out there. If you Google secondary transition, you get tons and tons and tons of hits. There's lots of resources that are out there. A lot of them are 100 pages long. So to really look at what are those primary pieces of information that you want that family to understand, and then continue going back to those in readdressing these issues and kind of building on that. And that's, again, why it's so important to start as early as possible in this process. It's also important to have this idea of working backwards, looking at where the family sees that young person once they are an adult. Where do they see them living, working, engaging in educational activities after they leave high school? Looking at where that ultimate goal is, and then working back to where we are now, and then deciding and developing that process. Engaging the family in this process, looking at their interests and desires. Also engaging in obtaining that youth perspective, and with that family, really having that, seeing their sons and daughters as capable adults, able to live as independent as possible in their communities. Looking at high expectations, and really, I think, looking at this last bullet point, assisting that family in helping them to develop their own transition plan, where they are moving from the primary caretaker to a secondary support person. And that's a major shift. And I think some families and families that I have worked with in the past really struggled with that letting go piece. Which brings us to this slide, and this is really talking about the young person with a disability that's in the transition process. And this idea of learned helplessness is something that really comes from you being the family, you being the educator, the teacher, or you being the person from an agency, either VR or the health system, or working in the IDDD system. So it's really looking at how we can create independence for that young person. There is true dignity in risk. And I think in talking with young folks with disabilities that have been really successful in their transition process, they'll mention that. And I think when we think about our own lives, we learn more from the mistakes that we make than the successes that we have had in our lives. We really gain a lot of information from that. So really working on this whole idea of developing self-determination based on the experiences that we can provide to the young folks that we are working with. So there are a lot of barriers, or a number of barriers, to self-determination for youth and young adults with disabilities. These include just a lack of self-knowledge about themselves, their strengths, their needs, what supports work best for them. Folks providing, as adults, whether that's a family member, educator, or agency staff, being too overprotective or having low expectations on what that individual can do, and then not providing enough opportunities or supports for them. So as I mentioned, it's really important that we provide opportunities for the young person to experience different tasks, even if they may fail in those tasks. The risk-taking part is really important. It's also important that young folks are given the opportunity to make decisions. And this is true of any individual with a disability, regardless of the complexity of their needs. This slide, again, is really looking at either families or within our own systems. Are we able to provide teachable moments for that young person to make choices, to have a reasonable level of risk, and to live with consequences if things don't go quite right, that they can learn from. So they can really become better able to be independent and to self-advocate. So some things in closing in this section that you can think about to do now. Help the young folks that you're working with to identify their needs and to develop strategies to meet those needs. Help them to improve on decision-making, goal setting, and goal attainment skills. Look at enhancing communication and relationship skills, and developing the ability to reflect on the successes and the struggles that they are having, and help them to also identify those supports within their lives that can help them. And again, in the next two sections, we are going to talk about some other strategies to help in these areas. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Tanya, and she's going to talk a little bit more in depth on some things to think about with family engagement in transition to adulthood.
Thank you, Michael. First, I'd like to thank NTACT for giving us this opportunity to share with everyone some of the strategies. Coming from a parent center, a lot of times, we do get those calls from the families that just left a meeting, and they seem to be more confused than when they went into that meeting. So, the goal is to help provide information to anyone who comes in contact with families on, some of those things that we may not think about, some of those things that we may not, come to mind right away when we're working with families, because sometimes, we have agendas, we have things that we need to get accomplished, questions that we need answered. So on the next slide, this is where I always kind of like to start any trainings. I have the great opportunity of working with our local special education technical assistance center, and we do a lot of co-presenting around engaging families for school, agency personnel. And we always like to kind of start with this type of question. Engaging families in the process is like blank because blank. So I think we all have had some good family engagement experiences, and some of us have had some that have been more difficult, and some that just are straight up frustrating. So we always like to kind of put, you know, in the context that there's a reason. We need to remember that everyone's coming from a certain perspective. So my standard answer usually for this is, you know, engaging families in the process is like gardening, because it's a lot of work, and sometimes all you can do is wait and see if it grows. And if you think about it, that's really what engaging a family is. You're trying to grow. You're trying to grow that relationship. So then that brings up the question in the next slide of, does family engagement really matter, right? We all have these objectives, these things that we need to do, but study after study will tell you, yes, family engagement is very important. And something I like to bring up too is that when we use the word family or parent, in today's world, families are made up of a lot of different things. It's not necessarily the traditional mom and dad. Sometimes we have grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. Sometimes there's other relatives. Sometimes it's, you know, foster family. So when we think of family engagement, what I want you guys to start thinking about is, who are those people in that youth life that make an impact, that make a difference, that are there to support them? You know, and all of the studies will say, you know, that home environment has a direct impact on that school environment. The more involved someone is in making sure that child is getting the education, is, you know, taking advantage of it, is getting what they need, the more likelihood there is for high school graduation, better attendance, better grades, and better behavior. So just, you know, there are lots of studies out there that have shown that it really does make a big difference. So on our end, you know, it is important that we figure out ways to engage families. So the next slide, when we stop and we really think about, you know, the research is telling us this, but I have a family that has moved 2 or 3 times. I'm not even sure what the current address or phone number is. I have a family that, you know, I'm lucky if I get a permission slip back from them. But what we need to realize is that sometimes we need to re-engage those families. When someone has a child with a disability and they first come in contact with the school system, they're attending meetings, there's assessments that are being done, there's ongoing conversations to help develop that education plan. And a lot of times what happens with families is through those elementary years, that plan, you know, it's been agreed upon, it's set up, it's running. And then as the student gets older, the family, you know, they have that trust and that confidence in the school is doing what they need to do. So they may just touch base a couple times a year, come to the meeting. And then once we move into high school, I think we need to remind our families that we need that re-engagement that we had at the beginning when the child first came into the education system, because now we need to start thinking about when the bus stops coming. What is that day going to look like? You know, we get very used to someone coming, you know, to the door or to the end of the street, picking up our child, taking them off to school for, you know, 6, 7 hours, getting educated, and someone bringing them home. But once that bus stops, we need to make sure that their day is filled with activities, whether that is continued education, continued training, continued learning, but it falls onto the families to make sure those connections are there. So getting connected to services, getting connected to those supports that are going to be needed once school stops. So moving forward, as we think of that, some of the barriers, you know, that come up with this process. And so when we were asked to present today, we, amongst us at the Parent Center, there was a conversation, and we realized there are so many different areas out there. There's so many different things that could cause barriers. But we felt that trust, communication, and cultures were three big areas that when we're working with families, where we really need to meet them where they are. We need to make sure we understand their perspective and where they're coming from and their needs, and then intertwine that with what we need from those families in order to help this youth move forward with their education. So the first one I want to talk about is trust. Next slide. So trust seems, it's kind of, simple, but we need to stop and remember that a lot of times trust is developed. It's about building a relationship. It's about having confidence that even though I may not agree with what is being said, I understand where you're coming from, and I trust that you're coming from that best advantage. You're coming from that best interest that you have for that youth. Next slide. So when you look at this little triangle, of trust, it really breaks down to building those relationships. So some of the questions that we need to, ask ourselves is, why do we need this trust? Well, we need this trust because a lot of times we need signature for things. We need permissions. We need, the family to know and understand why we're doing what we're doing. And then that comes into, okay, well, how do I build this trust? Or how do I know if that trust is there? And when you stop and you think about any relationship, there's that trust that is there that can easily be broken. So sometimes we have to make sure, if we're talking with families, that if we're saying we can provide this or we can do that, we need to make sure that it's really possible. Because if we've said, oh, we can do this, this, and that, and then suddenly, it's not feasible, it's not something that can be done, then that family is really, they're gonna start backing off again, and you're gonna have to try to re-engage them in some way to come back, so that we can all work towards that goal for whatever that student wants or that student needs to do it. And trust really is, it's kind of cliche, but it's that foundation to move forward. It's that agreement that, okay, we're all here at the table. We all, have this direction that we want to move, and trust that everyone is bringing forward the best ideas or suggestions that's going to help this young adult, move towards those next steps. But then we have to be careful, because on the flip side, sometimes we create too much trust. And this is personally where I've seen some of the disengagement from families. I will hear this a lot. Oh no, I trust them. They're doing what they need to do. They're making sure that the needs are being met. And the hope is that it's true, but what it causes is the family almost to sit back and let someone else make those decisions for them. And then suddenly, we're calling them into a meeting saying they're going to exit. They're going to exit school in June. What is your plan? And then the family suddenly realizes, oh, yeah, school is actually coming to an end. And so at this point, have they gotten connected to those services? Have they gotten connected to that support that they need? So when you're working with families, stop and just kind of do a self-check with yourself. Is what is that trust level there? Does this family know me? Is it a new family? Do I have to call and, introduce myself? Taking 5 minutes to call and introduce yourself to a family before that big meeting goes a long ways. For a lot of families, walking into that room for a meeting with a table full of people that they probably don't know that well, it can be very overwhelming for the families, just like we've seen it on the student's face when they walk in the room sometimes. So giving them a chance to know you beforehand, it kind of gives them that friendly face in the room because they've already have a conversation with you. They kind of understand what you're looking for, you know, the purpose of being in that room. So that takes us to the next step of communication. You know, communication is key. Communication plays a role in everything that we do. And I think everyone is really familiar with, you know, the listening, speaking, writing, body language, and that's all really important communication. But one aspect of communication I think we forget sometimes is our format of communication. You know, we live in a world of technology. Perfect example. We are all around, you know, the different states. We're attending, you know, a webinar. We're getting some personal PD. And when we're working with our families, we need to think, you know, what is the best format for them? Just because email is easy for me doesn't necessarily mean that that is the best format for someone else. You know, in Western New York, we have urban areas, we have suburbs, and we have a lot of rural areas, and not everyone has internet access. So, you know, to send an email may not be the best form. So, or, you know, a text message. Sometimes it is making that phone call. So I always just, you know, we like to remind families another step that goes a long way is saying, how would you like to be communicated with? Would you still like that letter in the mail? Would you like that phone call? Are you an email user? You know, because I also come to learn that just because pretty much everyone has a smartphone, it doesn't necessarily mean they always understand how to use everything on that phone. It doesn't necessarily mean that they do have an email account. So sometimes, you know, I've worked with educators over time and they'll say, oh, this family, you know, they just don't seem to care. They don't get back to me. They don't respond to emails, you know, and different things like that. And then I make a connect, you know, I connect with the family and I'm just trying to kind of figure out what's going on. And what I find out is that they're in a rural area. They have a cell phone, but it's a track phone and they only have so many minutes every month. And so checking email isn't a high priority for them. So a lot of times they didn't even realize or know that the school was trying to reach out. And I'm seeing this a bit more, especially with a lot of schools moving towards an online parent portal to gain grades and progress reports and that information. So I would encourage all of you, if you find families that you feel just aren't engaging or you're not hearing back from them, take a step back and just think about the forms of communication. How have you tried to communicate with them? And it could just possibly be that we're just not meeting that need for that family. So that can kind of help in that process of trying to get them to be part of the process, because we need them to move forward. There's only so much we can do within the scope of our jobs on that professional side of working with youth. And as was said in the previous slide, the families are the ones that are going to be there once everything else stops and goes away. So if we can start preparing them for that, and if it's as simple as, you know, once a month, I need to make a phone call. To me, at the end of the day, that's worth it to make sure that that family and that youth have what they need moving forward. On the next slide, I'm sure most of you have probably seen this diagram. I believe it's been around since 2006. And this goes back to that more traditional aspect of when we're thinking communication, when we're having that conversation. This depicts what happens at our annual review meetings, the IEP meetings. And I think it just really kind of says a lot of, who's doing most of the talking in these meetings. And in reality, it should be the families and the student because this is about the student. This is about figuring out, and especially when we get to that transition age where, you know, I know in different states it's a different age, but it's around 14, 15, that students have to be at least invited to their meetings, hopefully participating in those meetings. And I think, you know, when the families and the youth have more of ability to talk, that's their engagement. That's their piece moving forward of them saying, look, I want to be part of this process. I want to be part of, you know, moving forward, getting what we need now, so that once that bus does stop coming, that we have those connections that we need so that they can continue to move towards whatever those goals are. The next slide. I know that, you know, we briefly talked about culture in the previous slides, but I think, again, this is another area where we have some of those common cultures, you know, but each family has its own culture. And within that, different aspects of their culture play into that. In my area, we have a couple areas of Native Americans, and it is a culture within itself. And then even when you start working with the families, you see the different cultures within each family. So I think sometimes if we want that engagement, we have to kind of step outside our comfort zone a little bit. We need to understand, you know, that our needs and what we're looking for may not be the same from that family. You know, there are some cultures where if you are the oldest, there's an expectation once you leave school that you will become a provider. So if we're trying to tell this family about how he can go to college and he can do this and he can do that, sometimes the families will get turned off because we're not really hearing and listening to them. So I think sometimes, you know, it's about being respectful and listening and trying to understand where they're coming from and figuring out how to make it work for everyone, because, you know, we're charged with our education system to provide education and training and knowledge to these youth, so when they go out, they can move on to continued ed or careers or, you know, whatever they need. And there's an example I always like to use with this. I was working with a family that had immigrated to this country, and she, when we were working with her and we were asking her those traditional transition questions, you know, she said that she wanted to, you know, she wanted to become a chef, she wanted to cook, she wanted to, you know, own her own business, she wanted to do all of this, you know, great things in the culinary world. And then it was time for the meeting, and her father came in, and in her culture, the man is the one who makes the decisions and, you know, decides what the step is going to be. And when we tried to have that conversation with him, he said she has an arranged marriage. She's going back to our home country. So I don't know why we need to, you know, do all of this for her. Her goals are already set. This is what she's going to do. So what we ended up doing was really having an honest conversation and showing respect to that was their family and there was their culture, but we convinced them to let her attend a career and technical ed culinary program, saying that even though the goal was she was going to be a wife, she would need to cook. She would need to, you know, provide meals for the family. And so he agreed because he saw the benefit of that. You know, from our perspective, it was about helping her reach her goal of becoming a chef and a cook. But to the family perspective, it was really turning it around of saying, it's not just about that. It's really about the life skills that she's going to get from participating in this program. So I know sometimes it's not how we think. It's not how I thought that, we value education, and I think everyone values education, but within different cultures, it has a different level. And we need to respect that. Otherwise, those families will not work with us. They won't agree to some of the things that, in essence, we have to provide for those students. So just kind of keep that in mind, that, when you're working with these families, it's not as simple as just they're from this culture, they have this belief. It's how does that work within the family? What is that goal within the family? What does that look like? And on the next slide, as you're looking at this, I want you all to kind of think of each color as a different piece of that team. We all have our objectives. We all have, the things that we bring to the table. But ultimately, we all need to kind of be in that same direction. We're heading towards helping this youth figure out what is that next step. What are they going to need? What type of continued skill building are they going to need once they leave school? And is there a support or service or a program out there that could help them move and work towards that? And research. In the beginning, we talked a lot about how there is a lot of research out there about the importance of family engagement. And I included an article from Matthew Kraft of Brown University called Engaging Families Through Better Communication Systems. And the reason I liked this article, I feel like most of what's on this webinar, it's kind of like preaching to the choir sometimes. But I think sometimes we need reminding. And what I liked about this article is it wasn't too long. And basically, it came down to say that the outside world impacts school, and school impacts the outside world. And that by reaching out to families with, some of the good things, not just the bad things, that it really can make a difference for that level of engagement. So if any of you get a chance, just read this article over. It really does just reiterate a lot of the stuff between the first presentation and this one about those common things that help. Communication is always talked about. It uses the word teacher, but I really think these hold true to anyone that is communicating or working with the families. And the last resource we have is, it's called My Checklist. And basically, it's just when we're working with families, if it's someone who, we need to get re-engaged, there's just a lot of questions on there to kind of put us back in that context of meeting that family where they are, making sure that, we're engaging them in the right way, that we're encouraging them, and that we're providing that resource and information that we need from them. So again, it's just for you to use to take a glance at, to see, how are we doing? What do I need to change? What have I maybe not thought about? Or what haven't I tried in a while? And then the very last slide is just a list of the different resources that us as a parent center often use, refer people to a lot of these, pages. They have studies, they have tip sheets and fact sheets about information.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I really appreciate you taking the time to share all this wealth of information with us on family engagement today. Really appreciate it. And with that, we're going to slightly switch gears, and I'm going to turn this over to Lisa Myers, who's going to talk about the life course planning and family engagement. So Lisa, over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes this afternoon about charting the life course and how we are using charting the life course nationally to support families in having conversations and developing strategies about planning. We also use Charting the Life course to support professionals in having strategies about ways to have some of those challenging conversations as well. So with that, we're going to get started with the next slide, Michael. I just wanted to tell folks a little bit about myself. I am an independent consultant, and I do enjoy traveling around and talking about Charting the Life course. I also do person-centered thinking trainer, and I'm a mentor trainer for the learning community of person-centered practices. I'm also a family member, and hearing all the previous conversations and the presentations about family is just perfect because it was a nice segue for me to get started with my topic. I'm also a mom and a grandmother. I have 8 grandchildren, and 2 of my grandchildren have disabilities. So that's me, and I'm going to just jump right in and get us started on the life course journey. So if you take a look at the slide that's showing right now, this really is our mantra. This is our core value. This is our belief. And it really does come from that concept of all people. We had originally had the word disability in here, that all people with disabilities in their family. And we changed that to all people in their families have the right to live, love, work, play, and pursue their life aspirations in their communities. We did that very intentionally because the framework, the Charting the Life course framework, is something that is of value to all people, not just people with disability. Michael, you can go on to the next slide. All of us exist within the context of family. So if you think about that concept, it really kind of takes us to a different place when we begin to think about how do we support people differently. And when I say people, I'm referencing students, self-advocates, people with disabilities, because that's our subject today. One of the things that we have done with Charting the Life course is we have made an intentional effort to really partner with families in beginning to figure out, what are ways that we can begin to not only identify who's within that family unit, but also how do we begin to really have those critical conversations? And the we is all of us. How do all of us begin to have those critical conversations? I heard one of the earlier presenters say that family is something that's really defined by the person. That can look different for all of us. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone with a biological connection. So we are very much in support of people helping us to understand who their family is. And again, it's not about where the person lives or their biology or even their bloodline, but who does that person identify as their family? Michael, you can go to the next slide. I really like showing this slide because it really makes me think about families in general. So you just heard me say that all people live within the context of family. If you look at that very first set of circles there, you'll see that the blue has the person in the middle, the purple represents the family, and the blue is community. What was really surprising to me when I first saw this diagram was the fact that 75% of people on a national level are not receiving formal services, 75% of people with IDD, which kind of blew me away when I first saw that. But it sent another message to me as well. It was a message that, wow, well, if that's the case, then these folks are existing within community without getting paid services. So what are these families doing? They must be doing something right, and we can stand to learn something from these families. That was one of the first things that really kind of was a message for me. If you look at the second set of circles, you'll see that there's the person, and then wrapped around the person are services. And that is representative of people that are receiving services. That's those 25% of people with intellectual disability that are receiving paid services or are receiving system kind of supports. And then there's the family and community. One reason that we have laid that second set of circles out the way that we have is that sometimes families have said to us as professionals, once my son or daughter enters a service system, it feels like there's a wedge between me and my child, or it feels like there's a wedge between me and my family member. And for the purposes of Life Course, we define services or a service system. It can be any system. It can be an educational system. It can be a nursing home system. It can be a human services system. Ideally, what we want people to feel and to have the opportunity to experience is the third image on the right side, the far right, where you see the person in the middle, surrounded by their family, living within the context of their community as well. And then the stars are representative of the services the person needs, so that the person is getting the services they need without the family feeling like there's this barrier in between them and the service system. Michael, you can go on to the next slide. So if you take a look at what's on the slide here, and I don't know how well people can see this, but this is called an integrated support star. And we use an integrated support star to really begin to have some critical conversations about the person, the child, the adult, whoever the person is you're planning for. If you take a look at the top, the blue section, it's personal strengths and assets. And so that section is used to think about the personal strengths and assets of that person. And then jotting those down, maybe helping a family member think through those. The next section is relationships, which is on the far right side. So who does that person have relationships with? Are there family relationships that person has? Friendships, people in the community. At the bottom right is green, and that is eligibility-specific supports. And that's another area that we also talk with families about, what supports could their son or daughter be eligible for. Usually in that section, you will see things, if it's a student, it could be things like Social Security, maybe they're getting benefits through the human services system. As people begin to age, you might have folks getting veterans benefits or Social Security. In the other section on the left, the bottom left, is community resources. And those are all the resources that anyone could be taking part in and having access to. So that could be a gym membership, it could be church, it could be the library. Those are not paid supports, but just community resources that anyone would have access to. And then, of course, technology, really taking a look at technology and seeing where does the person have technology in their life? Are there areas that we need to add technology? What kinds of strengths do they have, etc. So let's suppose you were supporting a student who is transition age, and that student is interested in employment, and they want to begin to think about looking for work. So you could put employment in the middle of the star, and you could use this integrated star to problem solve around employment. Where does that student have relationships? Are there people that student knows that might be able to put in a word for them with an employer? What are the personal strengths that student has? what kind of assets. Maybe they type, maybe they could do any number of things that might qualify for them for that job if that's a personal strength of theirs. And the same with technology. So you would use every part of the STAR to problem solve around finding a job, or using a STAR to have a conversation with that student about what type of work they might be looking for. Michael, you can go to the next slide. A part of Charting the Life course is this idea of a good life for all people, and we think about good life outcomes. So in looking at specifically for the individual, it is supporting them in achieving self-determination. Also for the family is supporting them in ways that maximize their capacity and their strengths and their unique abilities. So again, we're looking not only at the person or the student, the young adult or the adult, but we're also looking at how we support the family as well. Michael, you can go to the next slide. This reminds me, every time I do a life course presentation, I have to think a little bit about person-centered thinking training. And this is one of the mantras from person-centered thinking. And we talk about helping people get better lives, not just better paper. And this is exactly what we're thinking about. So we feel that if a person's life is better, the paper is going to reflect that. So we want to start with the person first, and then we'll get to the better paper. Okay, you could go to the next slide, Michael. So you may be thinking, well, what do I mean by a good life? I simply mean that making sure that we're encouraging students, families to think big, think large, to have dreams, to think about things that are important to them. Thinking about having people who believe in us, being respected and valued as a contributing member of their community, feeling healthy and safe, having more good days than bad days, and having some control in their lives. Those are the things that most of us want, that will help us have a good life. And those are the things that we talk to students and families about. You can go to the next slide. So we use what's called a trajectory. And you may have seen this. And this is a Charting the Life course trajectory. And you can see that the arrow is pointing up toward the purple cloud. And that's symbolic of keeping our trajectory headed upward and toward the things that people want in their lives. And then, of course, the arrow going down is the trajectory that is moving towards things that the person doesn't want, that are unwanted. And so what we do is when we are having these conversations with families, we're asking them to think about your son or daughter. What is your idea? What's your vision of a good life for your son or daughter? And we're just posing that question to them. And then we're asking them to think about things that they don't want. What are some of the things that if they started happening or they did happen, what kinds of things would get your son or daughter off trajectory? We have had an overwhelmingly positive response from self-advocates and families, students who are using things like a trajectory. They find it very helpful for structuring conversations at an IEP meeting, for structuring conversations about goals that they would like to work on. For the student, what we hear the most is, when you think about a good life, just any, like a boyfriend, I want to get married, I want a job, I want to work, I want to make money. The possibilities are endless. So this is a really nice starting point for people who are interested in kind of getting their feet wet using Charting the Life course. So Michael, you can go to the next slide. And then you can just proceed on to the next slide. So one of the ways that we kind of support families is through having good life groups. The next slide shows a picture of a good life group where there are a group of families, educators, and students, and they are using Charting the Life course to work on outcomes. Michael, you can go to the next slide. So I talked some about family engagement and students and families using the Charting the Life course, but we also have a good number of professionals who are using Charting the Life course framework and resources. We are actually supporting people using Charting the Life course with early childhood during their ISP meetings, IEP meetings. Families are using some of the life course resources to have those critical conversations during doctor's appointments. We are working with several families who are involved in different family networks who are using Charting the Life course during presentations or speaking events. Very much so with young folks using them as a form of self-determination and advocacy, and for community integration. And we also work with self-advocacy groups to teach them how to use life course resources to find their voice. Michael, you can go to the next slide. Other things and other ways that we're using Charting the Life course are in supporting students, young adults, and older adults. Things like self-determination and advocacy, with community integration. And when I say community integration, either supporting people who don't feel very connected to their communities, and also thinking about planning for that young adult or student who one day intends to move out of their parents' homes, yay, and start their own life in the community. So how do we go about that? What are the things that we need to think about? And how to have those conversations in a way where it lessens the tug of war, or it lessens the challenge, and it's an opportunity to help families and the young adult find common ground, get on the same page, and everybody's opinions are heard and their perspectives are heard. Folks are also using Life Course for planning post-secondary education opportunities, employment. Some people self-direct their supports, and also using that integrated STAR for problem solving. Michael, you can go on to the next slide. I have a couple of examples that I wanted to share with you. Some of these examples, I'm sorry, I just pulled out my earbuds. Folks are using those for really learning more about themselves, self-discovery. It's been really interesting hearing young adults have those aha moments, especially when there's been a bit of a pushback from that young adult or student who's having conversations with their parents. Once we introduce Life Course and that parent has an opportunity to use Life Course to have a more structured, less defensive conversation with that student, and then the student will say, now I get it. Oh, okay, I understand now. But it's been very instrumental in self-discovery. So you can go on to the next slide, Michael. So here's an example. This is Caleb, and Caleb is a student. Caleb also, this is called a portfolio. This is just the outside cover of Caleb's portfolio. And Caleb did this for school, for high school, and just wanting people to know how best to support him. When he says here, learn my language, he uses different words for different things. He will tell you what those are, but he is very much respectful of people who really wants to kind of know what his words mean to him. If you go to the next slide, Michael, this is Elizabeth's example of a one-page profile. And Elizabeth's parents used Life Course as a way to begin to have conversations with her teachers because they felt that people saw her disability first and didn't really know who Elizabeth was because they could not get around her disability. What I think is really cool about Elizabeth is this is her handwriting, and you'll see that she's telling people how best to support her is don't assume that you can just push her chair. She wants you to ask if it's okay to push her chair, to be patient with her when she tries to figure things out. She needs time, and that's a good way to support her. And Michael, you can go to the next slide. This is the inside of Elizabeth's portfolio. And what's really cool about this is we've taken a trajectory, and on the inside of the portfolio here is the trajectory, but we're also using this in a way that looks at her past experiences, things that kept her moving upward on her trajectory, and then looking at future life experiences that she would like to have happen that would, again, keep moving her up toward her trajectory. But what's really awesome about this is it also lets us know what were some of the things that happened in Elizabeth's past that really got her off trajectory, things that happened that she did not really choose to have happen. She may have learned lessons from those, but she really doesn't want to go there again. And also things in the future that might get her off trajectory. So it's a really nice way for her to kind of self-identify. This is where I know where I screwed up, and this is where I don't want to go again. And it's also a nice a snapshot of thinking about outcomes, especially for those students who are in situations where they're thinking about outcomes and goals for themselves. You can go to the next slide. This is Elizabeth's integrated STAR, where she was looking at mapping out supports for herself. And she has identified here what her strengths are, who she has relationships with, the type of supports that she's getting that are eligibility specific, where she uses technology, and also where she's involved in her community. Michael, you can go to the next slide. This is Jessica's, and Jessica used hers to facilitate her IEP meeting. Michael, you can go on to the next slide. You can tell by looking at this work that Jessica is into graphics and design. So she really recreated her trajectory, which I think is very cool. So her trajectory is in her timeline. She talks about her plans as an adult, which is her good life. And then she also has identified the things that she does not want in her life, things would get her off trajectory that she would like to avoid. Let's go to the next slide. We have people ask us all the time, when should we begin planning with youth? When can you start using Life Course? And so you can go to the next slide, Michael. And I always tell people right away, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, infants all the way up to adulthood. We also focus very closely on the life stages. This is my grandson, Joshua, and Joshua is on the spectrum. And I did this slide because when my son and his wife first found out that Joshua was on the spectrum, some of the things that I heard from my son right away were things that he didn't want. He didn't want Joshua stigmatized. He didn't want him treated differently. It was very interesting to me because my son wasn't ready to think about a good life for Joshua. All he could talk about was what he did not want to have happen. And so that's where I started with Joshua's trajectory. I wrote down all the things I heard from my son that he did not want. This was Joshua's very first trajectory. He probably has about 12 now. But eventually, my son and his wife were able to come around and start having dreams and a vision for Joshua of what a good life would look like for him. Michael, you can go on to the next slide. We also have family perspective tools. I'll take you to the next slide. These are especially important when you're planning with young adults, and that's so that the young adults, the students, can have their perspective, and then there's the family perspective. And this is a really nice way for people can just do that free thinking and jotting down their thoughts and using these resources as ways to again, have those really rich conversations. Michael, you can go to the next slide. So charting the life course really is about having different conversations in a different way. It's really a different way of thinking. It really is about supporting people and having high expectations, integrating lots of different supports. And it's not just about the tools, and it is not a program. It's really seen as strategies for enhancing the work that you already do, strategies for enhancing families' abilities to be able to participate and engage. And the last slide, I believe, is just resources and my contact information in case you have questions. There's our website too for chartingthelifecoursetools.org. And the site is hosted by the University of Missouri at Kansas City, which actually is the creator and developer of Charting the Life course. And I'm one of their associates. So I thank you again. I really appreciate the time.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate
Sure.
it. I'm not sure if folks do have other questions. I did notice that Deanna did put in the link for evaluation, and I don't know if you want to just remind folks about that. And if you do have any questions, please go ahead. We do have a couple minutes if you want to type those in.
Right, please, you can type them in the Q&A spot. And then also in the chat box is the link for evaluation. NTACT really values feedback to make sure that our technical assistance is based on your needs. So please evaluate us and provide guidance for maybe some topics for next webinars. Thank you, experts. I really appreciate each of the perspectives and information that you brought to the table. And I really like that all of you provided some concrete examples that can be used with families and students. So thank you so much.
Great, and I'm not seeing any questions. All of our contact information is included. So if you do have any questions, you can either send it to me directly and I can refer it to the presenters, or the presenters' contacts were included too throughout the PowerPoint. So you can let them know directly also.
Yes, there was just one more question about can we download the PowerPoint from transitionta.org? Yes, you can. It would be located under the events section under the description for this webinar, and which you can also register for the next webinar, which is December 13th. And the topic is culturally responsive strategies for youth and young adults with and at risk for disabilities. So please join us next month for our webinar. You can register there under events also. Thank you, everyone, and thank you specifically to our panelists and experts. We appreciate the content. So
Thank you.
Sign off here.
All righty, great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your presentations.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you.